nosso tradutor precisa ter uma visão completa da vida. É com muito prazer que eu apresento para o grupo hoje você, professor Jaffrey C, Confere ncia da ANPOCS, que participou da nossa reunião em 86 do nosso programa, professor do Departamento de Sociologia da Universidade Estadual de presença obrigatória na nossa bibliografia de estudos sociológicos. E hoje, amanhã, ele vai nos falar sobre sociedade civil entre a diferença e a solidariedade.
Thank you for inviting me. This is my second talk, and my first one was 11 years ago. I'd like to start by recalling something that Borges said in his prologue to Ficciones. He said it's rather than writing a long and elaborate book, it's much better to just write a commentary about books. So today I'm going to give you a kind of commentary on a book that is not yet completely written, one that I've been composing for the last few years. In the February issue of Revista, of your Brazilian social science journal, I published, you translated one of the chapters from this book called The Relationship between Civil and Uncivil Spheres. And I'm going to provide a context for that chapter by presenting the model of civil society that I've been working on for the last few years. It's a sociological model rather than a philosophical model, but it has a definite normative or moral element to it. I was first drawn to writing about civil society in a sociological way from the experiences of democratization that occurred from the beginning of the Solidarność movement in Poland in 1980 through the years culminating in 1989. The non-Marxist, anti-authoritarian social movements that occurred throughout that decade in Central and Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, and of course in Latin America, and also in Asia. I visited Poland several times during that decade and spent some time in China before the Tiananmen massacre. And it was during that period that I realized for the first time the importance of the democratic framework for social struggles. And it made a big impression on me. I came to understand that the social sciences, perhaps sociology in particular, ignore the democratic context of struggles by focusing primarily on redistributed elements, by focusing mainly on hierarchies and different forms of domination, which of course are central, but that the sociology ignores the impact of the democratic or non-democratic frameworks that mediate all struggles over distribution. So by the early 1990s, after this kind of recognition, I began trying to develop a sociological theory of civil society. My view is that despite the reservations and qualifications that I'll be talking about in the course of this hour, my view is that civil society can provide a new object for social science. In other words, it could become, and should, it should become a new empirical object, a new concept a new theoretical topic for the social sciences. Like most of our other concepts in social science, although not all of them, this term civil society comes into the universe of social science from political and social conflict and contestation. It's well to remember that most of our concepts do come from social and political conflict. So that's why we're not in natural science, we're social science. So concepts like class, concepts like race, gender, sexuality, the nation, the state, ethnicity. All of these concepts came into the social sciences as a result of there being highly contested, politically fraught concepts in the real world. And I'm arguing that the concept of civil society should be secularized in the same way as these other concepts have been. Which does not mean that it should be shorn of its normative or philosophical implications, but that it should be made sociological. And by that I mean it has to be defined in an open enough way and in a precise enough way to be open to empirical variation and comparative study. Now, the problem with trying to take a concept like civil society, which is very much an issue in society, on the one hand, it's a great advantage because you're dealing with something which is undeniably important. The disadvantage is that nobody knows exactly what civil society means because it is a political term. It is a term that is argued about and fought over in real society. So you could say that civil society is a contested concept in a very traditional sense. It's contested in practice, it's contested in theory. So the first thing that I want to do, and perhaps this might be the only thing that I have time to present here, but I hope I'll have a little more time. First thing I want to do is to arrive at some clarity about what the different possible understandings of civil society are and to argue for a particular kind of approach. In a sense, what I would like to conduct is a kind of archaeology of knowledge of the concept of civil society. And I want to suggest there's three periods and three concepts of civil society that have existed in the history of this term. You could say that civil society 1 stretched from the late 17th century to the early 1800s. And this was the glory days, well, of the concept of civil society. It was associated with the history of the long history of democratic revolutions that began in England in the late 17th century through the French-American democratic revolutions into the early 19th century. It was formulated first by Locke when he changed the term of civil society dramatically from Hobbes' understanding of it, which had included the state. Locke defined civil society more or less as everything outside of the state, everything independent of the state. And he introduced, in doing so, what I call the umbrella concept of civil society, which says civil society is a realm, includes all of the institutions in society that are independent of the state. That means civil society includes the market, it includes capitalist corporation, it includes non-established religions, for example, Protestantism, which was something that Tocqueville emphasized very much in his discussion of civil society in the early 19th century. Civil society also, in this umbrella approach, includes the legal system, it includes professions, it includes the family. For example, Cohen and Arado make the family an important part of civil society, as it was for other theorists of the first phase of discussion. It also includes all voluntary organizations, something else emphasized by Hegel and also by Tocqueville. The famous names associated with this, with civil society one are not only Locke, but also the Scottish moralists, Ferguson, Adam Smith, Kant, Hegel, and Tocqueville, among others. So this approach associated civil society with liberty and formal equality, with freedom, and it attached this condition to the independence of a whole range of institutions from the state. What's important to remember about civil society, one, and it becomes very important when we reconsider what's happened since 1980, let's say, is that civil society in this period of time, which was more or less 150 years, has a very positive moral implication. It has to do with civilization, with self-discipline, with emancipation, with morality, and with democracy and participation. That very much includes a positive emphasis on market society, a positive emphasis on capitalism. As Hirschman pointed out so brilliantly in his book, The Passions and the Interest, capitalism from the late 17th century until the early 19th century was viewed as a civilizing force in relationship to the emphasis on violence, aggression, and prestige of an aristocratic, feudal, and knightly society. And if this sounds familiar, it should, because in many ways we've gone back in the world to civil society one, where capitalism has once again assumed a very positive moral position. The market, in many ways, has been taken to have a positive civilizing effect. However, I don't want to accept that approach to civil society, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. So we have civil society one from the late 17th century until the early 19th century. What changed then? What introduced what you could call civil society two, which lasted from it began with the rise of the industrial phase of capitalism in the mid-19th century, and existed more or less until the late 20th century. What happened in this period is that the rise of the industrial phase of capitalism gave the term civil society a very bad and stigmatized moral connotation. Civil society became reduced to the capitalist marketplace and to the social processes of an inegalitarian industrial capitalism. The paradigm and the main theorist of this inversion of civil society was, of course, Marx. His argument was that the civil liberties, the laws, the freedoms associated with the classical notion of civil society were simply superstructural camouflage or fig leaves for the operations of the selfishness and egoism of capitalist society. that civil society wasn't actually about freedom or democracy or emancipation, that civil society was actually about domination, poverty, selfishness, and inhumanity. That civil society suggests hierarchy rather than solidarity and horizontality. And civil society, one defines civil society as a horizontal relationship which suggests the possibility of community. Under the influence of industrial capitalism, the term either Marxist and non-Marxist progressive traditions became associated, in fact, with the opportunity for hierarchy and domination. So as a result of this inversion, which was classically articulated by Marx, but was expressed by many other people and thinkers in the 19th and early 20th centuries, civil society became the enemy of progressive social thought. It became something in many ways to be overcome. What really demanded attention was not the problem or absence of liberty, but the problems created by inequality. So equality became the focus of progressive social thought, and the challenge, it seemed to almost every progressive thinker, was to protect society from the market, to protect society from the effects of industrial capitalism, poverty, from exploitation, and from all the things that were supposedly emanating from that. And what we have is the emergence of big state theory and the concentration on what the state could do for society. The classic expression is communism, but very much also in different from socialism and the social liberal approach to the welfare state. So we're talking about a range of thinkers from Marx to Schumpeter to Marshall and even to Parsons. Because of this development, civil society disappeared from social theory by around 1850. It was just never talked about anymore. It wasn't mentioned. It wasn't where the action was, per se. And there became much less attention, almost no attention, let's say, to the range of objects associated with civil society in terms of civil society one. Very little attention to the problem of trust, solidarity, voluntary association, the emancipatory aspect of law. Law was still an object of attention, but only as a means, or primarily as a means of domination. And in general, to the effect of the causes and effects of democracy, except, of course, the economic causes and the economic effects. You couldn't say in Marxist terms that what became of concern to people was the social question. And I think that is a social question that characterizes contemporary social science in all of its many forms, in terms of issues of race, class, gender, economic and social questions, very broadly defined, struggles over distribution and issues of domination, at least until the early 80s. So this takes us, let's say, from the mid-19th century to the late 20th century, up to the period of more or less the democratic revolutions of the 1980s, which created a possibility for civil society to breathe. I think of the democratic revolutions of the 80s, which very much include, of course, Latin America, and Eastern and Central Europe, but also Asia and aspects of Africa. I think of these as world historical events, as a series of very deep social changes that that have and will radically reshape, obviously, not just the history of the world, but also will have big effects on social science. The thing I'm concerned with here is that these events reintroduced the concept of civil society into the lexicon of social theory and social science after it disappeared for almost 150 years. It introduced this concept because of the activities of social actors. They started using the term civil society. The Solidarność movement in Poland in 1981 portrayed themselves as trying to make a revolution of civil society. That was extraordinary. People started saying, well, what's that? What is civil society? And that movement was the most dramatic political movement of the last half of the 20th century, one of the great revolutionary movements of our time. In 1989, in the series of anti-communist revolutions, the term civil society was the principal reference point of those struggles. So the historical actors that the people of the world focused on, including intellectuals, used this term, and this term, in the course of the 80s, through a series of mediations, which are well understood, became reintroduced in the social theories of social scientists and philosophers and others. One of the effects of this dramatic social transformation was that it radically challenged civil society too. It challenged the very negative reading of civil society as a fig leaf for selfishness and immorality. Precisely, of course, because it wanted to reintroduce it, and it tied the re-emergence of civil society to civilization, to civilized forms of behavior, to morality, to emancipation. However, in challenging civil society too, there was a lot of ambiguity, because in many respects these movements reintroduced civil society one, and suggested a return to civil society one. This was obviously because the political actors and intellectuals and the masses of people who were making the revolutions against state domination returned to the kind of discourse of the revolutions against kingship from the late 17th to the early 19th centuries. And they needed a term, the umbrella concept of civil society was extremely useful and very strategic in that concept. They wanted the autonomy of all institutions outside of the state. So everybody from Valensis to Havel to the English political theorist John Keene's two books on civil society in 1989 used the term very much in terms of civil society one. Yet, while we can understand very well the historical and social reasons for the return